treating fever or normothermia.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Massimo. I've got a feeling I've got like BO or something because everyone's down the far end. I'm thinking, do I smell? Or maybe the chairman smell, but no, I couldn't possibly comment. Actually, it was lovely. I really enjoyed the talks before, and I think of myself more like it's a smorgasbord. Manu was the tasty topping, Sebastian was the meat, and I'm the dry bread at the end. Right, treating fever. Should we? Thomas Sydenham was so-called the father of modern medicine in England, but this was, 400 odd years ago. And he said then, acute diseases such as fever and inflammation are a wholesome, a healthy reaction of the organism to meet the blow of some injurious external influence. So he recognized that inflammation was necessary. Fever is a mighty engine which nature brings into the world for the conquest of her enemies. I also like this quote: the arrival of a good clown exercises a more beneficial effect upon the health of a town than 20 asses, donkeys laden with drugs. Perhaps he knew something we have to relearn. So pyrexia is associated with better outcomes in sepsis. So there are lots of studies showing that patients on arrival in the emergency department, essentially there's an inverse correlation. The higher the temperature, the lower the crude mortality. And you can see here, it's a sort of linear relationship. And this is a decent study, decently sized numbers from Sweden. And Nate Shapiro, who's at the meeting, speaker, from Boston, showed the same. So you had an increased risk. If you used hyperthermia as your reference, you were more likely to die if you were normothermic, and you were even much more likely to die, 10-fold odds ratio, 10 odds ratio, if you were hypothermic. We're fixated, aren't we, with lowering temperature? Must be bad. Let's lower temperature even more. So in the good old days of targeted temperature management, there was the idea, let's septic patient hypermetabolic, let's cool them down even more. The animal literature said maybe not such a good idea. This is from lizards, and what lizards do when they get septic, they actually look for sunshine. They actually come out of the shade to get some heat. And in this study, this type of lizard was given aspirin. And you can see, if my pointer works, you can see basically they were afebrile when they're given the aspirin, so no doubt they felt better because they didn't have a temperature, but they all died within 3 days, whereas the febrile lizards carried on living. Clinical trial, so this trial from France with severe bacterial meningitis, cool the brain down, make it less metabolically active, had to be stopped early because of harm, and the CAS trial also from Scandinavia. Worse outcomes if you were made hypothermic. So let's ask the question, is fever protective, and if so, how? Lots of potential mechanisms. Obviously, heat shock protein, so named because they're induced by heat, by temperature, are increased. And there are other mechanisms, but heat shock proteins, we heard about ferritin, S100, there are a whole load of things, have a whole variety of actions, anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory, reduce oxidative stress, anti-apoptotic, etc. And having a higher temperature may actually be beneficial. So a few lab studies. On the left is an old study looking at the growth of malaria in a culture with obviously erythrocytes with malaria parasites inside. And you can see they multiplied, the parasitemia increased far more if the culture was incubated at 37 degrees versus 40 degrees. Likewise, on the right, a pneumococcal meningitis model in rabbits. Again, an inverse relationship. The bacterial growth was inhibited at lower temperatures. And here's another one, another meningitis model, this time with Haemophilus influenza. And again, you can see that and CSF and blood, the growth in colony-forming units was much higher at normothermia compared, or temperature equating to normothermia as opposed to hyperthermia. How does the immune function at higher temperatures versus normal temperatures? So in this model, bacterial peritonitis, in mice given Klebsiella, if I remember rightly, you can see having a fever was protective. There was a doubling in a halving of mortality, but all of the animals died and died sooner if they didn't generate a fever. And they looked at, again, organisms growing. So you can see in blood, peritoneal fluid, lung and spleen, the growth of bacteria, certainly after 36, 48 hours, was much higher in the animals where there was no fever. And likewise, you see a differential response in terms of cytokine production. Bacterial growth. The graph is slightly weird, but it's the change, or the fall rather, in MIC, so the minimum inhibitory concentration of an antibiotic to kill the bug, and so it's the other way round. But you can see as the temperature gets higher, and these are a whole variety of different bacterial strains, you can see the antibiotics become more effective. So it's an in vitro model, ex vivo model, but you can see that they're more effective at 40 degrees, 39 degrees, compared to 37 or 38. So the big question is, should we increase temperature? This actually a fairly nasty man by all accounts, even when he was practicing medicine. I think, unfortunately, he had links with the Nazis, etc. So he's not one to be glossed over or praised in history, but he did win a Nobel Prize in 1927. So he was interested, he was a psychiatrist, and he was interested in neurosyphilis, dementia paralytica, and he thought, well, let's use temperature to try and kill the parasites, or the syphilis, and improve tertiary syphilis. And he gave these patients malaria and claimed great results. They got a temperature, they got better, he claimed, and won the Nobel Prize in 1927. More recently, Richard Hotchkiss, a much, much nicer man, and Anne Drury was the lead, did this really interesting study. They're based in St. Louis, and they randomized 56 ventilated patients who were septic but normothermic at baseline. And they were randomized to either getting standard care or actually warming them up to 1.5 degrees or more above their baseline temperature. And you can see they got good separation between the groups. Interestingly, small numbers, but there was a mortality benefit. Mechanism, obviously their big interest is immune function, and they found there was zero impact on HLA-DR, lymphopenia, etc., the things that their research interests focused around. But really interesting. Mortality benefit from being warmer rather than normothermic. So in summary, fever in sepsis appears to be a protective mechanism rather than pathological. Multiple mechanisms can be invoked: immunomodulatory, antibacterial, heat shock proteins, etc. Yet to have the large-scale trial, but I think the Drury study I've just shown you is really, really intriguing. And on that note, thank you for listening.
At the very end, I may conclude that my mom was right, telling that let the fever vent.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, completely.
Okay.
So did she give you paracetamol or aspirin, or not?
Not.
There you are. And look at you today.
Is there anybody who wants to ask questions or make comments from the audience? Please.
From
you've got them.
clinical standpoint in the ICU, how do you go about when it comes to fever and paracetamol?
Well, I now, actually for the last few years, I try and ban paracetamol. Because, again, we're all fixated, and nursing staff, junior doctors, on treating numbers. Oh, yeah, if the patient has pain, different matter. But just treating a temperature, put the bear hugger on them, give them paracetamol. I go, oh, no. And if they do, I cross it off, so they can't give it. Because I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. it's adaptive. The evidence suggests it's adaptive. I haven't yet gone down the Drury line of should we warm them up, and I think it would be really interesting to do a trial in these normothermic patients. But now, you know, when do I lose my nerve? How high should the temperature be? So I get a little bit uncomfortable, you know, because the nurses all moan at me if the temperature's kept above 40. But if it's 39, I'm now leaving them alone. You know, whether it's right or not, I don't know. We need the trial, but I think there's enough evidence to suggest we shouldn't be aggressively cooling them. I don't know if anyone disagrees, agrees. Please throw comments at me. But, you know, we're brought up wanting normal. And when you're ill, normal might not be the right target to aim for.
Well, thank you then.
Philosophical
conclusion.
Conclusion.
And we thank all the speakers for this excellent session and all the resilient audience that remains until the end into the room.
Resilience, yes.